Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Common Language. Today, we are talking about that 9 to 5, working wages and minimum wage with how we're being compensated, and really what levers of power there are to standardize, streamline all of this. We're going to get into the cutting room floor scandal and break it all down for you. So I'm going to pass it off to Mac as usual for our top line and tea.
Thanks, Case. Yeah, so to start us off, running through our top three top line and T items to give you guys an idea of just what's going on right now. So, first, RFK equals HMX, and that is the Hot Mess Express. And he is on a one-way ticket on the Hot Mess Express right now,
Yeah.
as we've been covering on the pod. I think it's so interesting. We did a Maha episode where we said this looks like a recipe for disaster. And that's what's cooking right now in the Senate. RFK had a Senate hearing. It was actually a House Finance Committee, but they got into all things CDC leadership and vaccine policy. He was pretty much obliterated on both sides, I would say. Both the Democrats and the Republicans came for RFK, citing his ineffective leadership at the CDC with all of the mass resignations and firings, as well as his controversial vaccine policies. And so this leaves Maha in a very contentious and just quite uncertain position. We don't know where they'll go from here, but right now, a lot of medical stakeholders are now calling for his resignation. Second big thing is the Department of Justice slaps Google on the wrist. This is a follow up to the AI episode that we did because this ruling will have lots of implications for the AI race, but it predates a little while back. So Google was essentially, they were charging them with being a monopoly, right? So this was an antitrust case where they said, Google, you have a monopoly on the search function. And DOJ found them to be in violation of antitrust laws. And the ruling was meant to see like what they would have to do to remedy this. And a lot of people expected that they would have to break up their company and sell certain products like Chrome, like the search. But it turns out that they're being pretty lenient in this case and allowing Google to remain intact. There is some data they will have to sell, but they won't have to break up like many anticipated. This will put them in a prime position for the AI race and have lots of implications for tech and AI. Congress is back in session. It is fall. September is here, believe it or not, and all good things must come to an end, even August recess. So they are back on the Hill, back in legislative business, and they have lots to do on their list as they settle back into DC. The big one being funding the government. They have until September 30th to pass a budget bill, whether that be a short term or a long term or a full year spending bill. Right now, there is very little indication of which way they will go because this is appropriations. They need Democrats on their side. And so that's a big piece of this puzzle as well. So the time is certainly ticking, and we'll see where they land with funding because we know that's also just been such a contentious thing with the Trump administration. So more to come there, but that's a little overview of what's going on.
Love it. And I also love the way that so many things we've already covered in past episodes continue to reemerge. It's just showing the prevalence of AI and these tech companies, the Maha movement, and everything that's going on continues to feed off each other. So, always something interesting. We are going to break into this cutting room floor scandal. So, for those of you who don't know, the Cutting Room Floor is a fashion podcast. It's run by Reko Omandi, and she basically interviews lots of fashion insiders. She's got a really big following, and she's always had her podcast with a paywall. It's been on Patreon the whole time, and I've only ever seen clips of it on TikTok because obviously she's posting a lot of that type of content. But the idea is that she gets the interviews that are really hard to get, and if you want that information, you go to her, and that's at a price. And I've always respected that business model. But just lately, all right, Just last week, she came out on TikTok advertising for an entry level position at the cutting room floor. The position was advertised as really all hands on deck, in person. Some people called it like three jobs in one. It's not that uncommon, especially in the fashion industry, to be asked to do lots of different tasks. And the pay has always been very historically low. So she comes out, she's trying to recruit for this, and she announces the salary of 55K. That sparks outrage. The fashion industry is, speaking from my very, very personal experience, there's always a cost of entry for what you need and how to get there. But in fashion, you have to be willing to chew it before you can eat it. And you're not going to see a very high salary at the beginning for some people for years. For me, it was years. I actually just found a pay stub from my very first actual fashion role, and I was making $16 an hour in 2015, and it was very challenging to live on that. That ended up like coming out yearly to under 30K, and it was very challenging to live off that. I lived in a two-bedroom, very small apartment with three girls, and one girl lived in the living room. Shout out to Carrie and Marina. It was the best of times, but it was also a struggle for food. So the scandal really is, how do we ask for all of these things and we're still serving junk on a platter for a salary? In the state of New York, which is where the job is being posted, there are minimum salary requirements that this I don't even think meets in terms of lowest salary. So that means that if you're hourly, you can cost less. So the discourse really is, how are we pushing forward for someone, especially like Omandi, who is pushing things forward and she's asking tough questions and she's trying to make fashion more progressive, yet we're still staying in the same old patterns that become a barrier for other people. As it is, fashion has also been very exclusive, very privileged, very white. Look at Anna Wintour. She's been in charge of Vogue for decades. She only just announced her technical replacement, which, let's face it, this girl's still very much going to be reporting into Anna Wintour. And it's a celebrity's daughter. All due respect, I heard she's great and I heard she's really nice, but she's definitely going to be doing whatever Anna wants. I think that's the understanding that's there. But essentially, here we are, 2025. How
Yeah.
are we making livable wages?
Right. It's been such a fascinating conversation that has started off of, if you guys are on TikTok and you follow this, you already know all the chatter online, but it has been so fascinating to follow it. There has been a large conversation around wages and compensation and benefits and pay and entry level slash like early, like junior level jobs versus senior level jobs, and how you compensate people for their quality versus years of experience versus expertise versus their talent. And it's very complicated, and we'll try to dig into some of these pieces today. But my initial reaction to this was similar to Casey's, reflecting on, how much money I used to make when I was starting out, and the industry I'm in, which is the politics policy side, and also the unfairness and the exclusivity that is baked into a lot of the payment structures in my field. And so I'll say, when I first started out, I did a program called AmeriCorps, which it's funded by the government. It's like a public service government program. And a lot of people use it as a gap year, either after high school before college or after college before they enter into the quote unquote real workforce. And that's what I did. And I was working at the nonprofit at a middle school, and I was making $23,000 a year, working 40 hours a week. And so if you break that down, that is way below the minimum wage. But this is part of what they tell you, like, this is just what it is. This is public service. It's not to pay well. And AmeriCorps is supposed to be like a short-term thing. But even after that, when I went into my next job after AmeriCorps, which was like my first kind of office job, that was in New York. I was living with Casey, and I was making, I wish I could find my pay stubs too, but must have been like somewhere in the ballpark of 45. I would say 45K.
Which was good at the time, though. That was like good.
Yes, and I also give our age again here. I will say
Yeah.
it was 45K in 20, this was like 2015, and I was making the 23K in 2014. And so obviously the when I was in making the, oh Lord, girl, I mean I was on food stamps because I was living in poverty.
Yeah.
And I always look back at that time like how did I survive off of
I
that?
know.
But even making the 45K, I was living with like three other girls in New York,
Mhm.
and we were eating hot dogs and
We all had flex walls in our apartment, so it was like not really supposed to be like a 3 bedroom, but we made it into a 3 bedroom. I shared a room with someone at that time. Like we were just doing whatever we had to do. When you're young and you don't really know your value and know your worth, and also you're not being told otherwise, what do you
right.
do?
I didn't learn how to negotiate until after grad school.
I'm
Grad school,
still
I had
bad
a
at it. I'm still bad at it.
I had a really fabulous professor, and she especially was like, interested in helping women learn how to negotiate because it's not something that we're really taught. And
Mhm.
so it wasn't until then where I learned how to negotiate my salary. But again, in the field of policy, it's almost very similar to the fashion industry case. There is this you have to work your way up
Yeah.
mentality, and just when you're at the bottom of the totem pole, deal with the low pay. So, for example, on the Hill, it wasn't until the past couple of years when then Speaker Pelosi passed a policy saying the floor for staffers is now like 40 something. I forget the exact number, but before that, like there were people on the Hill who were making
Yeah.
$30,000 again. And when you're on the Hill, similar to fashion industry, it's very time intensive, it's very high pressure. And so now that the floor is 40 something, and I believe the cap, which is usually like for chiefs of staffs and very high level policy advisors, is two something. It's like the low 200s. I want to say it's 205 or something. And of course, members of Congress, they make 175 about in the House and a little bit more than that in the Senate. So, those are the numbers. It's
Mhm.
public information. Actually, when you're working for the government, you can look up anyone's salary and see
Yeah.
what they make. But you'll see at the bottom, people are not making a lot and they're working very long days. All this to say is that this conversation around the cutting room floor has sparked a very interesting conversation around policy and
Yep.
what are the policy mechanisms and levers that affect wages and worker power. So we're really excited to dig into that a little bit today and talk about what's behind the scenes in the policy world, what's going on there, and what's the history and the context that's shaping compensation standards, pay standards, and protections for workers.
Yep. Yep. So that's a perfect segue into the conversation between livable wage and minimum wage. So, like Mac and I were just discussing, and I think one important note is we're also talking about two big cities. So, we were being paid very low salaries, but also the cost of living where we were living is still very high. So, when you're saying that these staffers are making 30K and below at times to live in Washington D.C. and or the fashion girlies are making 30K and below a decade ago to live in New York City, it's a high cost of living. The math ain't mathin', and parents are helping, or something is going on here because you're not going to be able to afford it. So, what is a livable wage? So, livable wage is the minimum income that a worker needs to afford a decent standard of living for themselves and their family. So, this means we're covering the essentials, right? Food, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, clothing, and provisions for emergencies. So, unlike a minimum wage, a living wage is geographically specific. To my earlier point, cost of living can vary significantly by location. So, if you're living in New York City or you're living in West Virginia, your cost of living is going to be very different. A livable wage is not a legal mandate, but it's more of a calculation of what a worker needs to live with dignity and really a target for adequate compensation. And this is not about living lavishly. This is about the basic needs and living in a way that is adequate and comfortable, but not extravagant or over the top. So That versus minimum wage, which is the lowest hourly pay that employers are legally required to pay workers. This is set by the government. The federal minimum wage is 7.25 an hour. This number has not changed since 2009. However, states are able to enact their own minimum wages, and effectively, 34 states have higher minimum wages, 5 states have no minimum wage, and 2 states are below 7.25. Across these 7 states, the federal minimum wage applies. So, many researchers and advocates hold that the federal minimum wage is not enough to afford a basic standard of living in most parts of the country. So that's going back to what a livable wage would be on a minimum wage. It's not working out. It's not enough. So weigh in on that because
Yeah.
7.25 is not livable. Back in 2015, like I said, I was really struggling and I was making $16 an hour.
Yeah.
And this is before taxes.
It's just so crazy. The most stark thing is when we see that this number has not changed since 2009, right? This number is not indexed for inflation. So it's not keeping up with the cost of living, with inflation, with increased prices. So how are we expecting people to live off the same amount of money to cover the basic necessities with numbers from a 2009 economy? I feel like that's where the policy comes into play here. And it's, I think, super interesting to look at where we are right now in this administration and some of their policy positions, because it gives us a window into how do we advocate for higher wages? How do we ensure that people are being fairly compensated and protected? But I will say that there's just such a long history here, right? This overlaps many administrations, many decades. What we're going to cover in terms of Trump's policies gives us a snapshot of where we are. But I would say that with the caveat that this has been an ongoing thing, right? Labor laws, I think, go back to a very long time ago. And I feel like case two, I always am like so fascinated by your takes on this when it comes to labor laws and protections and things, because I know your dad is very well versed in that
Mhm.
space and like an expert. So you know this stuff too. So it's very, all that to say, it's very layered. And I'm going to run through where the Trump administration stands or where they have indicated where they stand on this issue. And then we will get to talking all things wages and worker power. So where we are right now as it relates to the minimum wage. So Case just told you guys, what it is, and where the Trump administration stands is actually a little bit unclear. So Trump has been on record saying that he believes that 725 is way too low. He has specifically said, quote, it is a very low number. However, he has also been very hesitant to uniformly increase the minimum wage, specifically citing the challenges in California. And he has, quote, said, in California, they raise it up to a very high number, and you have restaurants going out of business all over the place. And so he has been unable to give an exact number of where he thinks the minimum wage should be. And he has yet to commit to any specific number, but he has been pretty steadfast in that the minimum wage should be looked at more from a state by state lens rather than the federal lens, because he goes back to the point that Casey made earlier, which is that it really does vary by where you live. And so earlier this year, Republican Senator Josh Hawley, alongside Democrat Senator Peter Welch, introduced the Higher Wages for American Workers Act of 2025. And this bill would essentially double the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, and it'll allow it to increase with inflation in subsequent years. Hawley said that this bill should be a priority for the Republican Party because, quote, if we want to be a working people's party, we have to do something for working people. When Trump was asked about this bill, he said, quote, some people agree with it, some people don't. Some people say it really turns away businesses, restaurants, etc. but he would have to speak to Josh because he's a good guy. And so, again, I think this points to Trump playing the fence with this issue. There is an acknowledgement that the federal minimum wage is too low, but there is all this uncertainty about where they go from here and all the political and economic implications with raising the minimum wage. So that gives us a good picture of where this administration is when it comes to minimum wage policy. But another big piece of it is workers' protections and the
Right.
labor laws. One thing that workers really rely on to ensure that they're being compensated well and they're in good working condition are unions. And unions are another just complicated, hot button policy issue. There's so much we can get into unions, but I'm just going to give it to you guys straight right here where we are with this administration. The big piece here is that in March, the Trump administration issued an executive order revoking Biden's previous executive order, which had increased the minimum wage that the government pays to contracted workers.
Okay.
So this is a special class of workers. When the government contracts to do whatever they do and they hire people, this is the minimum wage that they pay them. So under Biden, he had raised it to $17.75. And then Trump issued this executive order in March and lowered it to $13.30, which is what the rate was in the Obama era. And that's when me and Case talk about making $30,000, $40,000. That was the Obama era.
Yeah.
So he lowered it to that. And this is obviously not indexed to inflation. And then recently, a little bit before Labor Day, so like late August, he added more agencies to this list. So Trump decreased the federal minimum wage to $13.30 for contracted workers. And then there was another executive order that was issued that impacted federal workers' rights to unionize. And this is really interesting because unions, it's like a tool that people use to make sure that they are being compensated appropriately. But what's actually interesting is unions for federal workers cannot be used to negotiate for higher wages. They can be used to negotiate for better benefits and practices. So think like maternity leave, paternity leave, disciplinary action,
PTO.
overtime pay.
Yeah.
Yes, PTO, things like that. So
Yeah.
this doesn't necessarily have to do with wages, but again, it's the holistic part of like how workers are treated and compensated for. And so he took that right away from dozens of agencies. And so now federal workers are left without their unions and that tool to help ensure that they're protected. A lot of workers took issue with this, not only the federal workers who are directly impacted, but big union advocates who think that unions and unionization is really important for workers. So that kind of paints the picture of where the Trump administration stands with wages and worker protections. There's so much here. So what do you think about all of this, Case?
It's crazy. And just to go back to what you were saying also, my dad was the director of labor relations for a very big lighting and power company. So he negotiated with the unions on the management end. So I'm very familiar with the way that this rolls and how long it takes to negotiate even small little things, because the union's job is to protect their workers, but at the same time, the business side needs to run. So there's always this push-pull of trying to figure out what's fair on both sides, because there are times where the business itself could be too opportunistic, and then there are times where the union also will exploit whatever resource that they can to protect their workers. So like anything, it's a delicate balance, and you have to figure out where that line is. But unions also are good advocates for their workers and creating a bit more stability. When we have linemen out there working on the power lines, they're doing dangerous jobs and they need someone to be able to advocate for their proper protections. Otherwise, you have the Gilded Age robber barons having workers deal with abysmal conditions that are really hazardous, and there's no one there to support them. It's actually a power check is what it is, but the power can flare on both sides. I think when it comes to Trump and the way that he handles things, this is not really his forte. I'm going to be honest. He's a business guy. So he's not really wanting to play nice with the union. That's not what his MO has been. That's not what his repertoire speaks to. So I feel that he's not really the guy for the job, frankly. I think that his base, especially those who are in low income
Mm,
districts running on these minimum wage jobs, they're the ones that were saying we don't want our tips taxed.
yep.
He's trying to play into that, and I think that he knows that cost of living is really low. He's not an idiot on that point, but what he is willing to do about it is really the question. And actually, Josh Hawley, I disagree with him on like many accounts, but it is interesting that he is playing so hard for his people because he knows that he'll get primaried if he doesn't, A, but also he comes from a very working class community, which
Mhm.
the Republican Party, let's make that clear, they were not the working class party. This is a new thing. Him coming up and even saying that, I feel, is quite interesting. And he was the one advocating for the Medicaid cuts. He was not happy
Yep.
about that. He's now the one advocating for minimum wage. It's very clear that his priorities are, frankly, in check with his community, which I give him credit for. I think it's just really interesting that we do have some bipartisanship on the minimum wage, and it's
Yeah.
coming from Josh Hawley. But the
Hmm.
conversation needs to be had because here's the facts. You have places like California, to use the example that Trump is using, where they've raised their minimum wage. And guess what? People deal with it. You have to start somewhere. But the reality is, we have to compete with the times and we have to deal with inflation. So we have to go somewhere.
Yeah. And at the crux of this issue for me is making the distinguish because it does get so complicated, but it is important to distinguish between the small businesses versus the corporate ones and the
Yes.
corporate businesses who are manipulating and exploiting
Yeah.
minimum wage workers at the expense of $1 million packages for the executive level.
Right.
That's where I take the biggest issue and feel like there needs to be bigger labor protections and increased wages. Because when we
Hmm.
talk about the cutting room floor, that is a small business.
Right.
She's an entrepreneur. And I think in this conversation, making her the face of unfair pay isn't quite the direction we should be going in. It is
No.
sparking an interesting conversation. So
Right.
let's have the discussion. But also, let's be clear, the problem here is the big corporations who don't allow their workers to unionize or try to break up the unions,
Mm.
who are paying their workers minimum wage while C-suite people are making millions on millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
That's what's unfair. And that's what needs to change. And minimum wage needs to be higher to just literally just to adjust for costs and
Yeah.
inflation.
Yeah.
And I think a big moment that I remember when I was on the Hill was there was a lot of hearings with Amazon and
Mm.
them like breaking up unions, and that was in the news cycle really heavily at one point. And there I feel, oh, what was his name? It was Chris, might have been like Chris Smalls or something, and he was like the Amazon like union leader. And he went on the Hill and he testified and he said to the senators, you guys have to remember, like, we're the ones that make the company work. It's not the other way around. And that rang so true to me and something that has stuck with me when I think about this issue, because I think a lot of times we get it backwards. Oh, we have to give all these incentives and tax cuts and investments at the high level of the business or into the corporation itself, rather than thinking about the people who make the business run in the first place.
Yep.
So when you think about companies like Amazon, without these people, how do you think your orders are getting filled?
Yeah. Yeah.
They are the wheel behind the business. And so I think with the unions, it does get tricky because to Trump's point, right? You have to be careful when you think about the economic implications for the cost to run a business when you're paying higher wages, right? That does eat into cost. And you
Totally.
want businesses to do well and to thrive. At the same time, it shouldn't be at the exploitation
Yeah.
of minimum wage workers, especially. And you have to make sure that they're protected so that these businesses can't take advantage of them.
Yeah. And I just think that speaks, though, to the broader problem that we have culturally about who
Yeah.
is worth it and who's
Yep.
not.
Oh, preach, Case,
Because
preach.
let me tell you, fashion industry, you can tell me you're a creative director, you're this, you're an art designer, it's about selling clothes. Who's selling
Yeah,
the clothes? Yes, we
right.
need them to be designed, manufactured well, and all of this, but who's making the clothes and who's selling the clothes? Because those are the two biggest competitors. It's not whoever you put on the cover of the magazine. I'm sorry. Like, yes, that might get you clicks, but you need a good client experience. You need good logistics to have the product that is actually needed. There are so many of the little people who are actually out there grinding and doing the work, and you're catering to just the top. And
Yeah.
it's the same old issue every single where you look.
And I feel like another interesting piece of this too, and you spoke a little bit to it, is the dynamics and the bipartisanship versus this being an R or a D thing. Again, going back to Chris when he was in the hearing, I remember him saying, this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is a workers issue, right?
Mhm.
And we see how this issue has been both an R versus D thing sometimes, but also a
Yeah.
bipartisan thing at sometimes, which is so
Yeah.
fascinating
Yeah.
because for a long time, unions were very like blue, right?
Yeah.
And unions are, a lot of people give unions credit to helping Joe Biden get elected. His roots in
Mhm.
the union coalition in
Yep.
Pennsylvania, when we think of blue collar workers who are union
When we think
members,
of the working class
right?
party,
It's that. And
right.
then now you see things shifting and workers really aligning themselves more with Republicans. And to that point, a Republican member like Josh Hawley being on the front lines
Yeah.
advocating for higher minimum wage for the workers and how that is shifting. And also to give credit to other people before Josh Hawley, like he's not the first member
Right.
to introduce a bill to increase the minimum wage. So
Right.
that on the record. Many members have been fighting for this for a very long time. But I think, again, those corporate interests come in, and that's what makes it tricky and why we've never seen an increase in minimum wage since 2009.
Yep.
But you also have members who have advocated for things like universal basic income or guaranteed income, which is essentially a payment that we would pay to everyone so that there is a floor in which no one lives below.
Mm.
But that has been controversial too. And that has been seen more as like a left wing thing. Yang, when he was running for president, that was like a big part of his platform. I think we are starting to see shift a little bit more as a right wing policy that's embraced a little bit more universal basic income, especially when you think about AI and how
Yeah.
that's going to disrupt the workforce and that kind of being a policy solution to that disruption. So again, it's very multifaceted, and
Yeah.
the way that the different parties take on the issue or their angle in the issue, I think is what makes it interesting, but also very tricky at the same time. And so I do wonder, when will we see the actual movement from 7.25 an hour in
Right.
2025? Things have to change.
Yep. Could not agree more. And we also can go into the racial issue of all of this, which we don't have
Yeah.
time for today. You'll see that has roots and roots of history.
Yes. Give it.
Um,
Yes. Break it down.
Roots and roots of history. And it comes down to the fact that the equality is not
Yeah.
there. But with that said, we're going to wrap it up. And thank you all for listening. We really love to explore new topics and we love to bring policy into the everyday. So we will continue doing that. And we'd love for you to continue showing up for us.
Yes. Follow us on all of our socials: TikTok, Instagram, Substack, YouTube, and then as well on all of our podcast platforms. And we will talk soon.
See ya.
Bye.